Calvin T. Mann, leading EMIY, served over 20,000 youth through speaking, coaching, and mentoring. He has inspired us for years. Welcome to EMIY TV Podcast with your host, Calvin T. Mann, the Encourager.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to Put Your Family First podcast with Heather Teru and Calvin T. Mann as we continue to post great content and conversations about solutions. And my brother Keith Bennett put a title on my page for today, and I snatched it and I sent him a message. When did we stop parenting and leading? And I say that this conversation was important as I reduce this volume. Right? It was important that we really get into this conversation. And the reason why is because I just think it's important. That's me. I just think it's important that we have this conversation. Like it's an important conversation. And from one man to the woman to the next, parenting, if I can go into this conversation, parenting is a very important piece to the puzzle. One thing for sure is when both parents are not present, anything can happen. And my childhood and my life is indicative of that. My journey into learning to be a man and how to be a man is indicative of that, and everything that comes and goes with that. It's very, very important that we have these conversations and get to the bottom of the situation. So parenting is a teacher's job. I always say that. As a parent, you must be willing to teach. And with that, being of sound mind and body as a parent, we're supposed to be able to be there to police some of the antics that we put in our DNA into our children. And if we're not present, we don't even know how to call it out. We don't know how to see it. And so our parents, again, this conversation was asked to me, and so I'm asking you because I'm sure Keith Bennett had a reason for asking that, because he always has a reason for asking a question, and I'm sure that his reason, he most definitely is looking for some data and some input, and a lot of us were asked on our timeline, and so I'm asking you, when did we stop parenting and leading? Hello, Heather.
Good day, good people.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm kind of interested in this topic. I like to see how it's going to unfold, but we always begin. I always want to frame it for the people who are listening so that we're on one accord in this perspective. And this today, especially because it's a very sensitive question.
Right.
Because there are going to be a lot of people who say, well, we didn't stop parenting. And I just want you, when you're listening and you're out there, that is not a derogatory statement towards you personally. We are talking community, we're talking culturally, we're talking collectively. And so when you may be the exception in some areas to some of the things that you might hear, what I want you to do is to remember that you stand next to the next person. Your family stands next to the next family. Our families stand next to the next community, and our community stands within our culture. So the representation of each of those levels of being is going to be moving from the individual to the collective. And so if it doesn't relate to you in that way, what we still want you to do is to contemplate, to think about it, reflect on it. And then, because there are some areas where, whether it's not this generation or your generation, perhaps it was the generation before you or the generation before that. So keep that in mind, because your DNA, their actions, their behaviors, their circumstances are also embedded in you. So if you don't have it, you must be choosing to do something different. And that's a big part, I think, of this conversation today, is what do you choose to do different versus what we actually see happening today. So that's where I am.
Well, it's good, right? Because, again, I want to make sure that it's understood that by no means are we, where you said about people's parenting. When he asked me the question, I gave from the research and the information, because that was a question that I asked when I first got into this journey, but it was just such a powerful question to address, right? And from policy, from practices, from racism to more policy and more intentional attacks to, as you say, the promise and, right, the agenda, and then most importantly, the buy-in. When did we buy into the notion that, parenting and the part that parenting has played in what we see today, right? And everyone always has this conversation, from generation to generation. My generation, we shot goats, carried them in the backyard, cleaned them up, right? And, cooked them right there in the backyard on 2 pebbles and some leaves, you know what I mean? And then, the other generation was like, we invented, right? And so from generation to generation, which, I sit on this group of men where we've been having this intergenerational conversation. But more importantly, when did we start parenting and leading? And so for me, Heather, my timeline. Good afternoon, Mark. My timeline for when we started parenting, I said 1950 because in the research, what happened was that
take it slow, Calvin.
Yes.
Take it slow, because you run through this really quick. I think people need to understand the policies and the timing for this timeline. So I'm gonna ask you, go ahead.
Okay, so in 1950, during World War II, right, there were a number of things that took place. Now, this is a historical perspective. One, during World War II in New Jersey was a school called Bordentown, New Jersey. It was a black campus-built school. They had visitors from Albert Einstein to Wilma Rudolph every summer come in and do this work within the culture. And during the 1950s, when men were at war, right, you had these things going on. And so we needed to get help. And so the women came in and went to work, right? So we brought women in to went to work to win a war. Now, the war, no matter how we look at it, was a political war. Right? It happened. It had to happen for some strange reason, but it was a political war. It was with the biggest group of people. What was that? The generation, I forget the generation that they call it, right? But it was where there were so many of us, and so the women contributed to building and being employed and helping the process to win the war. Well, when the men came home from the war, the government was like, hey, got a great idea. It's like, what? We gotta let these women out, right? And it might come at the expense of men. It was like, oh, really? So, yeah. So in the 50s is when they began to allow women to work and be a part of the system. This is when it upticked. Not that so many men had a problem with it. It was an adjustment to the male because you had been pushing on the male that he was the sole provider, Mind you, in that agenda is racism and all these other things, right? Because anything to break up the home. So I say 1950.
So when you say break up the home, it's specific cultures that were under attack. It was the African American black culture that was under attack. So let's kind of put that under too.
Right. So we most definitely were under attack, but the complete family structure was completely under attack. So we understand it, right? Because again, women begin to have the option. It was nothing, they begin to have the option. Now, what happened is that you didn't have a choice. That's when we get into the 60s. So when you come into the 60s, you have the 64 Food Stamp Act, which takes place in the 60s. This is another attack on family, right? One, because racism was in hiring black men and black families, and black men couldn't necessarily really provide, so they had to create certain antics. But we had a structure where we had businesses, right? So we still economically could still provide for our families in the 60s. So 64, right? Then here come the 65 Juvenile Act. The Juvenile was originally supposed to be set up for, rehabilitation, not for it to be criminal. Now, again, the political aspects is the 13th Amendment is already setting and sitting right there for any crime for you to go to jail. So racism is in full effect because we're incarcerating black males for stealing a piece of candy. Anything to get that male into that prison system so we can get affordable work. So go for it. What you want to add?
So you call it affordable work, right?
Yeah,
You're talking about cheap labor.
Yep, cheap labor. Yeah.
Cheap labor.
Yes, cheap labor.
On the same level of slave labor.
Yeah, on the same level.
Yeah,
right.
so that's a really important, because there is cheap labor. And our history shows the cheap labor, but it doesn't show that there was a law, a policy that was put in place.
Yes.
For a particular culture.
It was in the Constitution. It's still there.
Right. For a particular culture to be pushed in a direction, back into a direction of servitude.
Right.
So that's an important piece of understanding as you're putting this timeline together.
Right.
So I just want to make sure you don't move quickly past that, because a lot of people may not know that.
Okay, so right, so we move into the 65 Juvenile Act, right, and now poverty is increased everywhere, right, because here comes Vietnam, right, because behind each war comes more poverty. I'll say that again. Behind each war becomes more poverty, because who is the investment in war? Who makes the money? They make a lot of money, tons and tons of money. They get rich off of war, right? So let's continue down. There's an uprise. You have the 68. Here we go. And here come the 68 civil rights, right? So the civil rights doesn't change. It's not necessarily that it's going to do anything. The civil rights allowed us to move into their demographic, so to speak. Here we are, we come out of these things, but at the same time, there's still an attack on the household because I'm not able to provide from traditional jobs. So I got this business, and then I'm not really being supported because that dollar didn't rotate. That dollar rotated in the black community 4 times before it left. So that's in the 60s, right? And the research in the Moynihan report comes back out, and it really watched why were we still together. They couldn't understand why we were still together.
And
meaning the black culture, they couldn't understand how we were still being married, how we were still staying together the whole night. So here come the women's movement, right? And the women's movement come right in the same breath as the civil rights movement. Here we come, right? And so the women's movement then moves women into the same lane as black men for employment. So then that wasn't enough. Vietnam has happened, taking place. You got people, drug dealers getting on donkeys, going over to bring heroin back to the community. We're destabilizing. The government throws in a ton of drugs into the community. 69, we dropped the No-Fault Divorce Act. So when the No-Fault Divorce Act hits America, the family that is going to be mostly impacted is the African-American family because, one, he was not in stable employment, and there were tons of men who, because of the law was on the table, gave up their entire household to their family, and they went to the streets. They literally, tons of them, gave up their households, right? Just so they could have access to the fatherhood that the government was providing to the families, the resources, and how they were strict on the African-American community, enforcing a man couldn't be in a house but turned a blind eye to the man being in a house in the white family. So the black family is completely indoctrinated and under attack. So parenting now, between 65 to 75, parenting is under attack. Why? Because we come to learn how important a dad really is to the culture. But the 13th Amendment, they knew that. They knew if we can destabilize the home, we can incarcerate, that we can get these resources, and that we would turn our backs on each other for the resource for survival. Not only that, what they didn't count on in the drug use and the thing for it to address and attack so many other American families. But what they were willing to let happen was to the poor white community, who is the highest upon the system. They are the ones who sign up the most. They carry the welfare system. So in that process, we buy in. It affects us even more because now we're split. Then 1975, because a lot of people don't want to really buy into truth. In 1975, as I sat in a room and heard the secretary from Child Support Enforcement share why child support came into play. So in 1975, child support came into play because white males was walking away from their children and not providing for their children. That's why child support became a law. That came directly from the political force of the government, right out the mouth. But in 1975, the National Organization for Women made an announcement that they would be the ones to raise the children, which created another divide because the women's movement, the whole 9 yards, we want to be in charge of the children. So here comes 75, here come the child support and that whole demographic. So what happened and when did we stop parenting? There were still a lot of successful parenting taking place. There were still a lot of businesses, black companies and things. It may not have been as much, but they are still intact. Some are still intact today. We are just not visual to them because the television, which was another attack. Let me give you these things. Right? So as we come down and you get into the process, so now you're 75, we done threw, the criminal Ronald Reagan and threw all kind of dope in the community. We buy into selling drugs to our own culture. We making money off of each other. Now, economically, you can say what you want to say, but if you sold, and I say this to any man, woman, or person, if you sold one drug to your people, you owe community service. You got to get back, not take away, because we're a different type of people, which we didn't have privy or information to understand how we are culturally. We're a different type of people. There's something different about this people. There's no reason why you would be attacked. You got to understand why you would be attacked and understand the greatness that come with you. So in that process, parenting becomes flawed, even more so, right? And so now you got the the mama's baby, daddy's maybe. You got all these rules and regulations that you find out. Yeah, you're not really the father. Then, in the 80s, here we go. We got more drugs. You got more issues. Now we're buying and giving our children everything, except for the life lessons that they need to learn. So when you come down the 80s, right, what do you have there? You have the disco kicks in the late 70s. You have this unbelievable drug culture, right? And then, boom, here come the 90s. Crack hit the doorway. And in particular, a lot of people don't like to hear the truth, but you had several drug agents and all drug dealers working. Drug dealers systematically work for the system, period. Because no matter how much money you gather, when they come knock on your door, they taking that money, you putting it in their system. It's not going back into the community. So you essentially help create more poverty because you took the drug away. And you took that away, and you took that away. So there was no investment. So that's why you saw houses divested in. You saw potholes and the broke down and the dilapidated, because people were not investing into their own homes. They were investing in the drugs. And so because here you go, the destruction of the home along with the parent, because again, we have been incarcerating males, father figures, and all within the system since the late 60s. Another attack. So what happened to parenting? It got hijacked, right? So when you come down into the 2000s, now you subjugated. In the 2000s, you subjugated to what? A high sense of drug use. Today, what do you see on TV every time you turn around? You see commercials with nothing but drugs and pills. Pharmaceuticals right. Became your what's the name? You saw on 60 Minutes how they incarcerated doctors. They put doctors in jail for life for selling opioids. They was getting over. They opened the door to the opioids, and then we're gonna come in and then we're gonna lock you up. And so now now we're yelling and screaming fentanyl, and then you're yelling and screaming these pills. Then you had right. So you got all these things, and so parenting was the one area that you needed to be strong in that you were not strong in, and it caused major problems. And the statistics come out and prove that. The statistics show 70% of the men that's incarcerated come from single-family households, fatherless children. And whatever they're incarcerated for, the number is still astronomical. If it's rape, it's murder, it's whatever it is, it's a fatherless situation, which means the system knew that was the target. So the 13th Amendment is eating good off of poor parenting. Now, poor parenting can be addressed in so many other ways, but to be clear, that's why I said 1950.
So I'm hoping that everybody that was listening is following that timeline. So it's really important, because if you were born within that timeline, if your parents were born within that timeline, it brings us kind of a generation behind and a generation that's present and the generation that is coming forth. I'm saying coming of age, coming forth, right? And so I think we talked about policy being a driver of our parenting, the effectiveness of our parenting.
Yes. So if I can say before you get in depth, and I said this earlier, as soon as you remove the male figure from the male seed or the male child, his masculinity is under attack. Period. It is not something that we can just sit back and say, well, no. As soon as you remove the male figure from the male seed, his cognitive ability is under attack. So is his daughters. So is her feminine content. So is how she carry herself. As soon as you remove that male figure from the child, you expose them to this system. Now go ahead.
So, well, that kind of brings us into the practices. What are the practices of parenting now? And I want to talk about three three things that I want us to just be aware of and really, again, reflect on these things. Don't look at it and take it from a place of it's personal and be defensive. What we want to do is, as individuals, as families, as community, and as culture, we want to look at this lens so that we can, if there's a gap for the person that's next to you or the family that's next to you, we can help bridge those gaps. So there's a way to do it, but we can do it because we've done it for centuries. That's how we have built a community, how we built our culture. So it is already within us. We just have to get back to the basics of where it's established. So before we get there, I want to talk about what we are doing now in terms of when do we stop parenting, or what is the new parenting styles. So I had three areas. One is that we have created a sense of entitlement in our children and in ourselves to a degree. We have this easy to get, hard to keep mindset and behavior.
Yes.
And we also have vision over values. I think this is really important. When I talk about vision over values, it's all about what we see, what we show on social media, not the values. We're not showing values often. We're showing stuff. We're showing, our trips to paradise. We're showing our fancy cars and clothes and diamonds and all those kinds of things. So I'm saying vision in that way, what you see in terms of vision versus the values. How can we circle that back to the values? This is, again, what we're doing now. So what we are doing now is what our children see us do, which is what they begin to mirror. They mirror our behaviors. One of the things that Calvin talked about is if the male child doesn't have a mirror, that father figure to mirror, he is going to be possibly be at a disadvantage, because the mother figure is the mirror for the daughter. And often the mother figure is the one that is present, and the daughter is mirroring her behavior.
So take this in consideration. And we talk about this quite often. Take this in consideration. If you take, how do you rewire the brain? You change what it sees. The cognitive behavior of a male versus the cognitive behavior of the female. If you take the female and she's in the house with the female, she gets every nutrient she needs to be strengthened.
As a female.
Mm-hmm. So if the male, right, if the male doesn't have his example, what does he get strengthened in? What he learns from the female. That is an impact and an attack that is very difficult for. You're asking a male to think in his late stages, right? One thing, Mother's Day was yesterday. One thing I'll say about my mom, all right? The one thing, get out, go see, go be. Come back, do what I say, but get out. When at the time when you say get out, in our neighborhood where I was at, there were male examples. There were men who were willing to do things. That's where I get it from. They were men who were willing to do things with us that didn't come with. This is where I get this from, because they did it for me. It just makes sense for me to do it for me again. So when you don't have, one of the first things I recognized when my dad and mom split was there was no more my dad dressing me up and taking me to hang and hanging out the window. There was no more of that. So it caused something. When that male doesn't have that figure, it causes something, and parenting has to improve by having both parents. But go ahead. I'm done. I'm good.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's important to have this conversation because, your family wasn't the only one having that experience.
At all.
And so, but that's what I'm saying now. So as individuals, we can line up. As families, we can line up. And again, in my neighborhood, on my block, the families lined up. So it was an individual. So most of the families on the street that I grew up with were two parents. It was the mom and the dad raising their kids. And the ones that didn't, the other neighbors kind of filled in the spaces. So my godparents, my godfather got killed went just before the major teenage years, and so my dad was right next door. So everybody called my dad Mr. Glenn, and so my dad would step up in those areas. And I appreciate how you have indicated this in the past, that a male's role is to be able to see and govern as far right as he can see and as far left as he can see.
Yes.
Well, my father, one, because his name was Glenn and we lived on Glenn. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah,
but
that was ego.
In his mind, he governed Glenn.
Right.
I mean, so if everybody knew him, he walked around the community a lot. He was present. And so his very presence, he always spoke to everybody. He always greeted everybody. If he had to intervene in circumstances or situations, he would then intervene, but he got the reputation that if I have to intervene,
I'll intervene.
I will intervene. And so certain things weren't said around him because people learned not to test him either. It was a couple early on that tested him.
Yes.
But that shifted the dynamic. So again, on my block, if your grass wasn't being cut, then one of the other male neighbors teaching the boys how to cut grass, or would cut the grass for the mothers who didn't have a man represented.
Right.
That was a huge part of taking in the slack. That's a huge part of filling in the gap. And so when as the men grew older, they were holding the younger men accountable, who were then teenagers and young boys, but they were holding them accountable. And so, boy, come on over here. I need for you to do this. And you say, Mr. So-and-so. You weren't arguing with them.
Right.
You weren't challenging them.
Right.
You might have said some stuff under your breath, but not loud enough for them to hear you because they had the permission in our community to check you. And whatever check you meant at that time for us, that's what happened. And again, it's because the individuals lined up, but the families lined up by each other, and then the community lined up. And so, we had some block to block rivals. We used to, dance it out, like to prove you the baddest block. You have a dance off with somebody. You didn't have a shootout. You had a dance off. You know what I'm saying? But that was something that was resolving your conflict was something that was within our community to do.
Yeah.
That became part of our culture. So for my generation that was in our community, we tried to resolve conflict. It wasn't always the violent way out. That came, the more drugs were influencing our community, the more that happened. The more the things that you see, the nanny goats and, all of the things that you were seeing. And even today, the things that we see, you're trying to take somebody else's stuff because it looks a certain way or it has a certain monetary value. That's about what you see, not about your value. So somewhere there was a disconnect. There's a disconnect between what we see and our values that we really are practicing now, that we need to unlearn that behavior because there are consequences generationally for that behavior. And so as we make those corrections and we make those changes, it sets the tone for the promise that we have in our community. We have unlimited promise. Every time there's a child born, that's a new promise. That is the benefit of having a child, is that there's a new promise that is born into the world. And they come into the world with a unlimited supply of that promise. How do we as parents then cultivate that? That's where our conversation needs to be in terms of our solutions. And that's where we're going to go in just a few minutes. Go ahead, Calvin.
Sure. You know what I mean? Like, sure. I mean, we got the information. So, for those of us who do have it.
Okay,
right?
there you go.
For those of us who do have the information, applying the solution is our job. How do you do that, right? How do you get people to understand, right? Because part of it, again, is the things that you choose not to do. If you choose not to teach literacy, if you choose not to teach math, like I got a picture from my grandson, the table and stuff that we bought. He's sitting at the table, not even 2 years old. Like he's being prepared. On the floor is A, B, C, D, all of that. His imagery around him, the vision of the things that he see will be tremendous to how he conducts himself, how he acts out, right? As far as his mama, because my daughter, she different, and y'all know as women, y'all could be different, so I understand. But as far as we can get him to become a young man, that's the key, right? And so he could then take off. But more importantly, the solution has to look like, in my opinion, this is my opinion. A lot of you may not agree, as you don't a lot of times. When we're talking about toxic relationships earlier today, it comes from this environment. We talk about why men are so abusive or controlling or misogynistic. It comes from this environment. It comes from an environment where we're taught the wrong things, assume the wrong things, see the wrong things, and then we apply it and take those negative things and make them positive. The Bible tells us, Proverbs 17:13 tells us, if you take something negative and make it positive, it'll never leave your house. So you've adopted some of these things that you saw and thought that was so important and true to you, that you're willing to put your pride behind it versus the outcome. You have parents today that are jealous of their children. Their children have an opportunity. We will take that kid's opportunity away. Why? Because if we don't prepare the child to be a successful student, sometimes we're taking away the opportunity and we're creating some of the very things that we don't like. And that is okay. We found that to be okay. So I don't, or we can't, so why should you? You see? And so our children are acting out within the community. We are missing that children 5 to 11 are number 1 in suicide. Children 11 to 24 are number 2 in suicide. And we can go on. The numbers are astronomical for the boy. Just posted the other day, the numbers of boys is in the percentage. I could read to you the percentage. This is just the percentage this is the percentage. I want you to hear this percentage here. This is a percentage just on suicide. This is a percentage right here. Male and female percentage of suicide deaths, 15 to 19. 15 to 19 years old, males, 76.6%. 20 to 24 years old, males, 82.5%. Well, where is that coming from? Right? And then the numbers are tremendously low for girls. But why? Where is that number coming from? Why is it so low? Because she has the in-house role model. He doesn't. So when we are talking about the importance of understanding the solution around parenting, right? It's a real thing for us. Parenting is everything. It's everything.
And I just want to point out that there are also blessings in parenting.
Tons of them.
And if we miss those opportunities, we're missing our blessings as well. So it's not just, forward thinking in terms of what our, how our children can be, but it's also present as a parent and it's future for your parenting. So, And there are lots of scriptures. I wish Dave was with us though, but there are lots of scriptures that talk about the blessings that come to parents, and the honor that's due to parents for taking on the role. So I want us, as we're looking forward to the promise, when we talk about bringing our children into the world, parenting begins as a seed. Parenting is a seed that's already within you. And depending on what you're imprinting on that seed, it's going to also determine how that seed is cultivated and nurtured. So we have to make better decisions about who we are intimate with and bringing forth children. So if you know somebody is toxic, whether it's male or female, you might want to reconsider that sexual connection, because if you have sex with somebody, you should just assume that you can have a baby with them. And so I don't think we take that perspective when we start. We're so much more connected to our physical, what we want physically, and the pleasure that we want to experience physically, or the release that we want to feel physically, that we forget that there is a spiritual component to that. Procreation and creation work hand in hand. Procreation, the seed of an idea, and creation, the seed of an idea, work hand in hand. One is supposed to deliver physical life, human life. The other is supposed to deliver human ideas. So both come through both male and female, and require both components to operate and flourish. So you got to make sure. You don't have to do anything. Let me step back. But it's in our best interest. It's in your personal best interest. It's in our family's best interest. It's in our community's best interest. And it's in our culture's best interest to choose wisely or abstain. Choose wisely or choose differently. Because we are connecting ourselves physically and spiritually to a seed that is going to be cultivated. Part of that cultivation happens in our backstory. It's in our DNA, the life we lived and the life we continue to live. And so if you're be more selective and more intentional with the idea that if you decide to have physical intercourse with someone, that the possibility for a child is already there. You don't get to take that back. Ooh. So being mindful of that, being mindful of the character of the person, being mindful of the value of the person, being mindful of the behavior and attitudes and stability of the person, we have to really look a little bit deeper, because we are birthing children into a world, birthing them in at a disadvantage because of our choices. And then, especially if you don't want to or are not ready to have a child, to cultivate the life of a child. Calvin, one of the first things he talked about is that a parent is a teacher. So if you're not ready to teach, you may not be ready to parent either, because they go hand in hand. And we're teaching all the time. When you see your child stand up or pull up, because they're looking at you. They're looking at you walk around. They're looking at you reach for things. They're looking at you read books. They're looking at you watch TV. They're looking at you on your cell phone. They're learning from you every day, every time. They're mimicking your words. That is how they learn how to speak, because they hear your voice. They hear what you say. So if all you say is negative things, or all you say is curse words, if all you say is things that pour or cultivate that into their soil, that's what we're cultivating into our children. And sometimes that entitlement comes from that. Comes from hearing those things, that the values that we are planting need to be planted and cultivated. And just, and sometimes as a parent, you don't have all of the answers. You don't have all of the answers. And that's okay too. But it's not okay not to find them. It's not okay not to seek the answers. It's not okay not to change the direction that your life is going and your child's life is going. So as we look forward to the promise, and the promise, you can look at this multiple ways too, and there are lots of scriptures that support this too, if that's what you need for your proof. But the promises that are ours for generations to come. We have promises. We have physical health. We have spiritual health. We have wealth and prosperity that are tied to our children, tied to our legacy. So we need to be more aware of the blessings, and we need to be more aware of the promises that are due for our children as well. Living longer. We want our children to live longer because we know they are the promise. They are the untapped potential. They are the unlimited abilities. And so we really need to make sure that we are taking these next steps in terms of looking at solutions. How do we begin to now teach our children about being a good parent? How do we start doing that? How do we prepare them for the lessons and the life lessons and to find those things and to work for what you earn and earn what you work for? And I'm not just saying work in terms of working for someone else. How do we teach that entrepreneurial spirit? How do we teach them to be creative? How do we teach them to be innovative? These are all the things that come with the promises. Go ahead, Calvin.
Well, I mean, you got a list here, and right, you covered it all. New to old ways. The traditional way of parenting is still intact. You don't even have to whoop your kids if you're teaching them. So that's one thing. I mean, you there are some things that you can teach your kids to avoid that is important without you having to whoop them, right? You can parent from your children's strength, right? What is your child's strength? Your child may be funny. I tell the story all the time. I was funny. I was I was funny, the funniest guy in the township. No question. I was the snap king, hands down. And everybody knew that. I used to shut down parties, cracking jokes. Then I did a comedic video. Hey, my mom, she didn't see that. She had me erase a whole family. Like, I could have been Dave Chappelle. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, I know it's not late for you to be a comedian, but my point is that was a strength of mine. I was funny as a child. Mm-hmm. So you could have capitalized on that. Singing was a strength of mine. I could have learned to play the piano and all those things. Those are things that had happened. But my dad was in the house, and my dad was in the house. Maybe I would have got all of that. But my dad is not in the house. That means one person got to take care of 7 kids, and that's tough. Right? The other thing is parenting from your DNA. All the actions that you do, everything that you do in life is being recorded. Now, you can put it any way you want to put it, but understand, you must realize whatever you were on at the time of that child's conception, that's where you have to parent from. Because all these children are going to be different because you're different at the time that you have them. And that's real. And the fourth and last is parenting from spiritual practices. Meditation. It's a good form. Keeps the kids calm. So if you're meditating, they're learning to be calm. They learn to interact differently. They learn to have a different conversation. You're going to church on Sundays, and you're teaching from the church, the pulpit, and they're going to learn those things. These are the areas for which they be. Now, it might not be their strength when they become an adult, but the words is train them up in the way they should go. But I believe if you keep your children indoctrinated in things that involve their strength, it would benefit their entire family. And for me, the last one is teach legacy. Too many of our children don't even know who their grandparents are, what their grandparents are about, don't have no idea, don't know where they come from because you have so many broken situations that it's hard for them to get to learn. I mean, I deal with it. I deal with that with my children. Right? Where they spent most of their time was over their grandmother's house or whatever. That's where they are. They bought into those traditions. That's where they are. It's tough, but until I can get on top of, what I'm trying to get on top of and create better traditions that they can come and see that the tradition is being consistent, they know how to pick up the phone, call their daddy and all of that, but that's where they are. Because that's where they spent most of their time. And so for us to understand is that's the equalizer, time. This is one of my quotes. Mom and dad, you can make all the money in the world, but you just can't make up time. Encourage me, I'm young. The kids are telling you, where you place your time, that's where you will prosper. If you don't waste your time, put your time into teaching and shaping, for me, people will say you're not the greatest dad. But for me, what I taught is present, it's obvious, it's visible. Character, all of that. Reading, all of that is obvious. What I taught is present. And I'm constantly teaching. And I'm still sharing. And we're still having conversation. Regardless of the case, parenting is a forever, ever, ever thing. Right? You don't stop parenting. And put it this way, even after you go bye-bye, you sleep and you gone. All those lessons that I didn't hear or that I didn't pay attention to, I'm still being taught. Parenting is the most amazing job, and we have to do better at that job. Heather, you have
my closing statement.
Yes, your closing statement.
Well, I just want to encourage you that every day is a reset. If you find that you've done some things in your yesterday, then change it for your today and your tomorrow. You have a choice. Every day you can choose differently. You can choose wisely. You can choose. And so don't feel trapped. Don't feel locked into a certain belief or a certain practice. Pick up a book, instead of Googling for, something that is less value. Google something that's more value, your own development. Because remember, it's the individual first. It's the individual, then it's the family. So if you're not in order, then you should be mindful that your family may not be in order. So continue to do your reset, continue to do your self-work, continue to grow our families and prosper our families, because we have and we can make the difference of the promise for tomorrow. So we can do that today. And we must do that today.
Well, you know me, I can only go by what I saw. I can only participate in things that I've seen. You don't have to agree. But one thing I can say about my family, we're a family. The one thing I can say, sitting at my Uncle Eddie's funeral, where we were celebrating and watching his sons take to the podium and go through what his request was, that each of his sons, yes, Bernita, each of his sons being able to come and close the funeral, and then watching the oldest son step up and step into his role as the oldest son and speak on it, and proud to take it on, and how they all decided that the legacy was going to be it. This is it. One thing for sure, Dad, we going to carry these standards and these principles on. Uncle Eddie didn't play with time. He wasn't a time-playing guy. Too many people play with time. Right? He even left a message for the preachers. I don't know why y'all talking about church going to start at 11. And church don't start till 11 a.m. So you start out in the pulpit telling lies from the word go. My Uncle Eddie was very consistent. And everything he did, he was consistent. If he said he'd be at your house at 5:30, I used him several hundred times as a plumber. So yes, he was there at 5:30. So understanding what a legacy and what it consists of, but understanding that together they had 50 years of marriage. That is the fourth 50-year marriage in my household. My brother, my oldest brother, is next. He had 40-some years. God bless his soul, he make it to 50. 50 years of marriage. Grandkids and all. That's what we do. That's how it's supposed to be. And that's what we'll do. That's why we call it Put Your Family First Podcast. Because we know nothing but good comes out of it. Not everything is perfect in a family. But if you work together and you understand and you have respect, anything good is possible. I love my family, and I love the work that we do. My name is Calvin Mann. Calvin T. Mann, as the T stands for terrific, tantalizing. And I'm just glad that God has used me. I was a mess. And today, I'm a blessing. Thank you.